Right, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this afternoon's webinar. I'm just going to wait a couple of minutes in case people are kicking on and joining us a few minutes late. So we'll aim to start officially in about 2 minutes. Thank you. Right, I think that's a good moment. And let me repeat my welcome. Good evening, good afternoon, and potentially good morning to those of you in different parts of the world. And it's a great pleasure to welcome you to this afternoon's webinar hosted by Crutham. My name is Justin Brzeski. I look after the impact capital practice here at Crutham. I'm based in Johannesburg, and I'd really like to say thank you for taking the time to join us this afternoon as we unpack the subject of outcomes-based finance and its ability to tackle Africa's youth employment crisis, as we've titled today's session. I'm going to introduce my fellow panelists to you as we kick off the session and just explain how our running order for today. I'm joined by 4 people. My colleague and Executive Chairman at Crutham, Dr. Stuart Theobald, will kick matters off. Second up will be Shamsia Ali, who we're delighted to have joining us from the UK. Shamsia is going to be talking about some of her experiences and her extensive experiences in the United Kingdom, working in outcomes-based finance, and particularly in the employment context. Followed by Kilian Nango, who is a partner of Crutham's from East Africa. He's based in Dar es Salaam. And Kilian's going to be dealing with an interesting perspective really related to this intersection between outcomes financing as a solution to help business. The fact that business needs skills funding and the ability of the skilling sector to produce the right kind of graduates faces challenges, so he's going to offer us some perspectives on that. And then lastly, not on your official program, but just to make things really practical, we've asked the program director of the Jobs Boost program in South Africa, my colleague Riyad Ibrahim, to join us. Riyad's going to spend a few minutes giving us some highlights of the Jobs Boost program, which has been running for just over a year here in South Africa in its pilot phase, and some really interesting insights are emerging from that. So we're delighted to have all 4 of them joining us today. Thank you, my panelists, for agreeing to speak today. And with that, I'm going to kick off with just a few setting the scene slides. We're going to be speaking each, well, not me, but the panelists are going to speak each for about 10 to 12 minutes on each of their topics. You're welcome to start posting questions into the Q&A and the chat, and we'll pick those up as we come to the end of the sort of prepared speaking section of the program. And we're going to leave 20 to 30 minutes at the end for questions from members on the call today. So please do feel free to make use of that functionality, and we'll do our best to pick those up as we go through things a little bit. All right, so let's kick off. I guess, and this is a slide that I like to use. It's not unique to any particular country, but it does talk quite powerfully to the population dynamics of the African continent. And those of you who are familiar with population pyramids will know that, effectively what this is illustrating is we have a vast young population in the continent. And what that means from a population dynamics perspective is that as that young population ages and moves through the schooling system, you have millions and millions and millions of people who enter the workforce or potentially entering the workforce. And that creates what economists like to call the demographic dividend. And that is that often once in a country's history opportunity to harness, firstly, a productive opportunity as many, many people in theory enter the workforce. And secondly, there's a fiscal benefit as well, because those people who are earning wages start to pay taxes, and that creates a significant cash flow into the fiscus of each country. What statistics and the modeling that is done by the World Bank and other organizations are starting to tell us is that the populations of some countries in the continent are basically expected to double by 2050. Population growth rates are still well over 2% in most countries, although they are falling, still very high. And the continent is expected to be the world's youngest. And some of the countries in Africa, for instance, Zambia, I think is often cited, is expected to be one of the youngest countries, or countries with the youngest overall population on Earth, within 1 to 2 decades. Now, what does that mean from a workforce perspective? And what does it mean for the young people who are getting older and moving through the schooling system and entering, in theory, the world of work. Well, typically, according to some research, both by the World Bank, and although not cited, the ILO as well here, is that only about 15% of young people aged 15 to 34 are actively engaged in either formal education or formal employment, and certainly high quality work, work-based training. Unfortunately, and this talks to the left-hand side of this particular diagram, a significant portion of young people in this age group are either partially disengaged or what is termed fully disengaged. And that's illustrated by the two arrows here. What does that mean? Effectively, it's meaning that the labor market is not absorbing young people, okay? And that is leading to very high levels of what is termed economic disengagement. And this is in spite of the fact that where you are seeing quite high economic growth measured in terms of real GDP, that is not being matched by an uptick in levels of youth unemployment. And what some researchers are calling this is the fact that decoupling. You're seeing a decoupling of economic growth from employment, but particularly youth unemployment. And so this is creating a remarkable challenge for many governments on the continent, for policymakers. It's providing fascinating opportunities for researchers. The question is, what can be done about this? Yes, significant amounts of money are spent, particularly public money are spent on skilling. And yet we are seeing this picture persisting with some countries, including my own here in South Africa, with remarkably high, almost staggeringly high levels of youth unemployment. And the range potentially from the high single figures of youth unemployment to well over 50%. And that is, if not harnessed, and we were talking about the opportunities presented by the youth population and the growing youth number of young people in our countries, is the recipe for not harnessing that could be quite high degrees of social destabilization. And that is certainly of concern to many people. So I'm going to hand over to Stuart in a second here, but really just to introduce the outcomes funding concept and our work at Crutham on outcomes funds, and indeed the work on youth unemployment broadly recognizes that there are but one of a number of pieces, of puzzle pieces, in attempting to solve for this. It's not the only one. And essentially what you are looking for at country level is for policymakers to be recognizing that there are a number of tools available, including use of public works programs to get young people starting into the world of work, recognition and support for the informal economy, inclusive hiring practices, and indeed going as far as and using modern technology, alternative capability assessments that measure the attributes of young people and their readiness and willingness to work, as opposed to potentially just pieces of static paper that they acquire either through school or post-schooling education. So outcomes funds certainly create one opportunity for this, and I'm going to hand over to Stuart now, and he can start to explore that a little bit more. Stuart.
Good. Thanks very much, Justin. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us. I'll take a step back and start with the question, what is an outcomes fund or outcomes-based finance, or pay for results, pay for performance programs, the bigger picture and conceptual terrain that matters. Outcomes funds have been with us for probably only a decade and a half as they've developed around the world. You might have heard of instruments like social impact bonds, which were a forerunner of outcomes funds. And it's a kind of procurement approach that allows us to improve efficiencies in delivering outcomes in specific social services. So it might be employment services, but outcomes funds can actually be used in many different fields. We see them in early childhood development. We see them in non-social services, in environmental outcomes, for example, and many other fields. In the sort of global context, the very first ones were started in the UK, which is why it's great to have Shamsia here, who really has got a depth of institutional insight as to how they've evolved in that context. But we see them now used across the world, from the United States to Colombia in Africa. We see them in Sierra Leone, Ghana, Kenya. We run them in South Africa. We've developing in Zambia, in Namibia, in Tanzania, and elsewhere on the continent. And as a general point, our focus is often to work at how effective public sector spending is on delivering the social outcomes that are aimed for through social policy objectives. They're not only about social or at least government spending. We also have developed outcomes funds that focus on corporate spending through social responsibility, also through philanthropies who can use outcomes-based finance approaches to improve the effectiveness of their spending. So it can be embraced by many of these different partners. But governments tend to be at least a participant in many of the schemes that have been developed so far, especially in an African context. I see Buchla is asking if slides will be available in recording. I think the answer to that is yes. But also, while we're on the topic, I see my colleague Woody has posted a link to a previous webinar we did on outcomes funds, which really sets out some more of the basic elements of what outcomes funds are. I'm going to repeat some of those stories quickly now, but if you want to go back and go through some of the fundamentals more carefully, that link that Woody's provided there is an easy way to do that. Right, so let's start with a scenario of how we make pizza. All of you, I'm sure, can imagine quite simply that there's lots of things involved in the value chain of getting to you being able to pop down to a takeaway or a restaurant or call up a delivery person to get your hands on a pizza. There is training that happens of staff who work on it. There are ingredients that have to be bought. There are premises that are needed. There is hiring people who do it. There's marketing that's got to be done. All of those are inputs and activities that are involved in getting us towards to an outcome of actually delivering the pizza at the end of the value chain. Now, for most of us, we don't care about the inputs and activities. We want to buy a pizza that works for us, that is what we want. And we could leave it completely to the business that's operating to decide what inputs and activities are appropriate. And we kind of, to some degree, trust the market to do the job of ensuring that these businesses are efficient, so they deliver our pizzas ultimately at a decent price. And indeed, we can shop around to make sure that we are getting a decent price in the marketplace. But then let's think for a moment about how we do job creation. So typically there are lots of inputs and activities, and a lot of these are funded by governments and social services at various levels, from local government up to national government programs, where you can have explicit, carefully designed training programs. There are learnership programs. There are educational institutions, very substantial tertiary or skills and TVETs running through to higher high schools and so on, all focused on conveying skills to young people in the hope that it equips them to be able to get a job. We often have training programs, internships. We sometimes create tax incentives to really drive businesses to hire young people. So all of these activities go into the process. And we hope through on a theoretical basis, through a theory of change, that these are going to lead to our desired outcomes, which is young people obtaining quality jobs and being able to be successful in the workforce. Now, when we think about how we fund these programs, typically, we spend a lot of the money on the inputs and the activities. And a traditional approach would be for us to use grant-giving schemes, where we would ask partners to develop programs. It can be specific skills programs, specific qualifications, focused on young people. And we would finance those programs by providing grants to enable those activities to take place. And we see that kind of activity in many of our countries across Africa and elsewhere. And of course, there are a lot of problems with that approach, specifically in that we often don't get the outcomes that we intend. So when we design programs and we imagine we've figured out what skills are required and what kinds of delivery programs will achieve those skills, Often we find that the world has changed. Young people sit with qualifications but are unable to secure those jobs that we thought they would be able to. And it's the public sector that carries that risk. So when we design these programs and we spend the money, ultimately the risk that these programs will fail to achieve the outcomes still sits with the public sector. But what if we were to design these programs a little bit more like how we acquire pizza, in that we pay only for the outcomes at the end? So in that scenario, instead of providing grants and other forms of funding to partners to carry out activities and produce inputs or pay for inputs, we shift the spending to the outcomes themselves. So we say to those partners, instead of paying for your programs, we're going to pay you for the successful outcomes of those programs, the successes we intend, and tie the money to the creation of the jobs themselves. Now, what happens when you do that? Several things. So the main one is that risk shifts. Instead of sitting on the shoulder of the public sector, you now shift it over to the private or voluntary sector, who are the ones who will take on the risk of failing to achieve the outcomes. They will engage in the programs and activities with the intention of delivering the outcomes, but if they don't work out, they are the institutions that carry that risk and live with the failure. So that is a primary distinction between our typical programs and a pay-for-performance program like an outcomes fund. So there are lots of different incentive effects from this broad model. One, to just go through some of these incentives themselves. The primary one is that it encourages innovation. There is a high degree of freedom that you give to an implementing partner when you're paying for an outcome, because you don't, as the public authority, need to be concerned, or at least overly concerned, with what the money in your grant is actually being spent on, because you no longer carry the risk that spending is going to fail to achieve the outcomes. So when the risk is sitting on the implementing partner, you can give them the freedom to tackle the problem however they want. And that incentivizes innovation to solve for the specific barriers to success in delivering those outcomes. And I think you'll hear from our other speakers how that really works in practice, that we see innovation arising in outcomes programs. You also encourage partnerships, and we see in typical procurement models that the incentive on the partner is to try and monopolize as much of the value chain, to consolidate the revenue and funding opportunities as far as possible. But when you shift to an outcomes model, there is actually a change in incentives to partner with those who are able to add value and improve the probability of outcomes. So you focus on maximizing outcomes and decreasing the risk of failure, instead of trying to capture the revenue flows for yourself. It drives efficient resource allocation. So by this, you can think about costs, that when we are focusing on outcomes, and if you design a program appropriately, you can put pressure on the costs of achieving those outcomes. Often when we see programs in public sector evolve into an outcomes-based finance approach, usually it starts by looking at existing activities, understanding what the value for money of those activities are in terms of how many of the objective outcomes are achieved for the spending. And in evolving to an outcomes-based approach, that benchmark tends to set the baseline on what to expect. So usually, and there are different design features we can talk about much more in Q&A, but often you'll see that a rate card approach is used. So you would look at your traditional program and say, well, we're currently spending X per unit of outcomes. Let's set that price and see how many people come and offer, or at least willing to partner, to deliver those outcomes at that price. But over time, you can work on reducing that price as partners become more efficient, as they develop, use the innovation, that is the space that's available to them, to become better at reducing risks of outcomes failures. So you get a pricing improvement. And if you design programs carefully, that pricing improvement can be really significant. There is also enhanced transparency and accountability. You now get outcomes. They are audited and measured independently. There is no dispute over what is being achieved in a program. There is no ambiguity about it. And that enhances transparency, accountability, and it's much clearer to the public. And we see this in youth employment programs as an example, where there is, in many of our countries, spending that goes into skills development with very unclear outcomes. How many people actually are able to get jobs because of these programs? In an outcomes fund approach, you get an exact number of how many people have been able to get jobs, as well as a lot of detail over where, how much, etc. on those jobs. It is then scalable, and this is another important feature of an outcomes fund. Traditionally, they would start with a public sector funder, but it doesn't have to stop there. And it also doesn't have to stop within single budgets in a public sector. So over time, and as outcomes funds demonstrate success, we can see that new partners want to join in because it becomes clear that it provides the most effective value for money for their spending to achieve those objectives, which in our context of youth employment. So there's a scalability that comes as an outcomes fund proves itself, it can bring in additional budgets from public sector, private sector, philanthropy, the development aid that's still available. And then a question, it improves risk management. Now, we see this very clearly in the outcomes funds we're involved in, and maybe Riyadh would touch on this in the context of Jobs Boost. But the way those implementing partners, those suppliers of outcomes, manage the risk of failure is hugely different to traditional programs because they carry the risk in an employment context of a candidate not being able to actually get that job at the end of their program. We see outcomes, we see the partners working with employers very closely to really understand what they need, trying as far as possible to contract up front so that they're reducing the risk that they're going to be spending resources on training someone who might not actually get a job. And you also see much better management of those job seekers to really understand what about them in particular is frustrating their ability to succeed in obtaining and keeping a job. So you see vastly more customization of programs to improve the success and probability of outcomes. So that gives you a rough insight as to what we're talking about when we say outcomes funds, what's different to business as usual. And there's that link to our previous webinar if you want to know much more about the basics of how they work. And I see some questions coming in, but let me leave it to Justin to pick up on questions when we get it.
Stuart, yeah, thanks. And Rebecca, thank you for your question. Noted, Stuart, if you want to just read it up, I think it links quite nicely to what you're talking about and in volatile economic environments, how quickly one wants to make the phasing of these projects. Right, so we're going to hand over to Shamsia in a second now, just to give us some perspectives on the evolution and more of outcomes funds, particularly in the employment context from the United Kingdom. And looking at the slides ahead of today's call, I was really astonished at just the sheer, the amount of development and the evolution of these structures over the last 20 or so years. So let me hand over to you, Shamsia, if you wouldn't mind taking over, please.
Great. Thanks, Justin. And it's an honor to be on this panel with you all and to be in this discussion with the wider audience. So pleasure to be here. Thank you. So if you will indulge me for a little bit, I'm going to take us out of Africa and put us in the UK for no other reason than to just kind of sort of take some learnings and lessons that might be relevant for the African youth unemployment context. And I'll try and pull all of that out as best possible. Could we get these slides up, Justin? Ah, they are up. Perfect. Thank you. It's on my screen now. So what I might just do is set a bit of context to start off with. And again, indulge me for a little bit. I might just give you a bit of a context to myself and then move into the context of the presentation. And the UK labour market. So as Justin introduced, I am Shamsia Ali. I'm an independent consultant and have been for the last 10 years. But results-based financing or outcomes-based contracting, whichever terminology we use, has been a running theme of my career over the last 2 decades plus some. I started actually my first ever job in the UK in London as an employment advisor. So I was working on a programme where our payment was attached to the outcomes we achieved for the job seekers. And I, as an employment advisor, had a caseload of unemployment residents who I supported into work, and I was measured on the success of how many people I was getting into work and keeping into work every week and every month. I then did move into managing employment operations and programs, but also then in business development, where I tendered for large multi-million-pound employment programs commissioned by the national government, tendering and securing them and then implementing them. I also then worked on the flip side in the UK, where I was part of local government and designed, commissioned employment programs to our service provider base, local service provider base. And all of that was payment by results. So really what we mean by that is those programs and the service provider that are delivering those programs, as Stuart was suggesting, they are paid only when they achieve those outcomes. So hopefully some experience to bring into this presentation. What I am going to do in today's next 10 or so minutes is provide a real high-level overview of how payment by results, and you'll hear me use payment by results and outcomes-based contracting interchangeably. Forgive me for that. I mean the same thing. They often it's the same thing that often is called by different names. But I will be giving an overview, a very high-level helicopter overview of how payment by result funding structure has been used in the UK to commission employment programs. And so I'm going to be focusing on national programs that have been commissioned by national government, and then try and pull out, as I said earlier, some of the key features and learnings and insight that would be beneficial for us when we're looking at the African context and youth employment in particular. So it won't be a detailed overview of all the programs that have been delivered or commissioned in the UK that have used payment by results, and it won't necessarily be a nuanced narrative of the evolution of the use of payment by results, for no other reason than time is limited, but I will try and pull out the most relevant learnings for us. And then a bit of context, I guess, about the UK labour market and the UK employment service. It is worth bearing in mind that in the UK, we have a welfare system. So if you're unemployed and looking for work, you can sign up, as we term it here, and claim benefits and receive benefits for looking into work. And so when the government commissions employment programme in the UK, it is really commissioning service providers to support job seekers come off welfare, come off benefit and move into work. So when we started, and certainly when I started in this sector just over 2 decades ago, the sector was known as welfare to work, because it really was about getting people off unemployment benefits and welfare and into work. And so it's really, I just want you to kind of bear that in mind, that it is about how the government is commissioning and what they are commissioning for. And because the large-scale flagship employment programs are commissioned by national government and linked to the benefit system, for the job seeker, for the service user, not wholly, but on the whole, particularly if you're on the main benefit for unemployment, your participation in these programs, these employment programs, is mandatory in order for you to receive your benefit. So often what would happen is the government's delivery arm, the job centre, will administer the benefit, and then at certain point, the job centre will then refer the job seeker and mandate them to engage on these employment programme. For some, on some programmes and for some cohorts, I don't know, thinking from the past, if you're a lone parent claiming benefits, you could have volunteered to participate on programmes. So again, something just to bear in mind. And then I guess the other main context to really pull out is that the use of payment by result on employment programmes in the UK is really part and parcel of outsourcing of public service by the government to the non-state sector, whether it be the for-profit sector or the not-for-profit sector. So how do you as government demonstrate and determine the most effective, the most value for money of taxpayers' money? How do you commission services so that they are delivered most effectively and efficiently? And payment by result is very much intertwined with that concept of outsourcing public services to be delivered by the non-state sector. Justin, if we can go on to the next slide, please. So I'm going to spend most of the time on this slide, but not go into too much detail. But what this slide shows is the main flagship programs. And again, I haven't demonstrated all of them here. The main employment programs that the government had commissioned using a payment by result funding mechanism from the 1990s right up to the present day. And it's really the 1990s, the late 1990s, where the UK government started to commission, it started to outsource employment programs to the non-state sector. Previous to that, and still during this phase, it was the government's delivery arm, so Job Centre that I mentioned, which is part of the Department for Work and Pension, who would have both administered the benefit payments and then also provided what support, limited support that they could provide to the job seeker looking for work, but it was very light touch. So in the late 1990s, we get the outsourcing, and some of these programs ran together concurrently in different geographies. And it's a way of the government testing different models. So we had initially to start off with the employment zones and PSL New Deal, and PSL stands for Private Sector-Led New Deal. So the employment zones and private sector-led New Deals both was the first experiment in payment by results on employment programs in the UK, and how service providers were paid on these programs was on achieving outcomes, in this case, job outcomes. But it was actually quite light touch outcomes-based contracting. 80% of the service provider's fee was still drawn down at the start as a service fee, almost like a traditional grant. So as a job seeker was referred onto the program and you registered them onto the program and engaged them, you actually drew down 80% of the funding for that individual. The other 20% was then linked to you achieving an outcome. And initially on both the employment zones and the New Deal, private sector New Deal, there was only one definition of outcomes, which is a job outcome, so an individual going into work. And the other 20% of your fee was drawn down when you supported somebody into work. But actually, very early on both of those contracts, the lesson was learned quite quickly that if you're paying just for job outcomes, that's what service providers will deliver. And people were going into work, but actually not staying in work. And the service providers were still receiving the payment. So very quickly on both the employment zones and private sector-led New Deal, the government restructured the contractual agreements and the definition of outcomes. And so we had two outcomes, the job outcome, but also keeping people into work, sustained outcomes. And sustained outcomes was measured at 13 weeks. And that's because there was data and evidence that showed that if somebody had stayed in work for 13 weeks, they are more likely to stay in work longer term. So we saw a quick learning there. The other interesting thing about the private sector-led New Deal was actually this was a way of the government testing the value of the private sector. And again, I use the private sector term here quite loosely, meaning both for-profit and not-profit. So really it's the non-state sector. So what's the value of the private sector in delivering employment services? And what we had during the private sector-led New Deal era was that we had New Deal operating across the countries in different geographies. And some of those contracts were delivered by the private sector. And that was my first experience of employment programs in the UK. I started work on a private sector-led New Deal program. And in other parts of the country, it was still being delivered by the Job Centre. And there was a league table that contrasted and compared performance between private sector-led New Deal areas and the government-run New Deal areas, and which were performing better. Actually, that league table and that comparison was flawed for many reasons, not least that the geographies aren't so comparable. But what it did demonstrate, a key learning that the government did pick up from this, was actually there was a place for the private sector in delivering employment programs. There was value. And what it demonstrated was that those that needed light touch or no support, no intervention, that's what the job centre was great at, getting those people into work. But those that did need intervention and support, the private sector played a really good, valuable role in providing that support and intervention and brokering the support and supporting those job seekers secure and stay in work. Then in 2009, we had the introduction of Flexible New Deal. And what we have seen in the UK is that every time there's a change in administration, change in government, we see a change in the flagship employment programme. Because God forbid you continue with the programme of the past government. That's an absolute no-no. So we saw the introduction of Flexible New Deal, and Flexible New Deal only lasted a couple of years because we had another election and change of government. And what we saw in Flexible New Deal was actually a shift in the outcome payments and how they were weighted. So on employment zones and New Deal, you had 80% pretty much upfront as service fee, and 20% of your contract value as a service provider was given when you hit the outcomes. In Flexible New Deal, that was flipped. And so we had 20% paid to the service provider as a service fee, and then the remainder 80% was paid on outcomes. And we'd see an evolution of how you define outcomes. And so job outcome was now somebody going into work and sustaining for 13 weeks. And sustained outcome was somebody, that job seeker, staying in work for 26 weeks, so 6 months. And what was really interesting about Flexible New Deal was this, as it moved into much more of a purer form of outcomes-based contracting or results-based financing, there's this really question about, well, how do I, as a service provider, how do I deal with the working capital I need at the start of the programme if I'm not going to be paid and not receive the bulk of my payment until I start hitting those outcomes? And on an employment programme, it takes time to support somebody into work. So there is a lag factor between the intervention, getting somebody into work, and you as a service provider drawing down your payment. So there's a working capital issue. How, because running a programme, your staff, your premises, your training, all of that takes funding up front. But also, when you've got payment where 80% is attached to outcomes, what does that mean for existing service providers, particularly the not-for-profit sector and the smaller organisations who deliver great services but don't have access to the working capital they need? So what Flexible New Deal did was test this idea of prime contractor model. And so Flexible New Deal actually with much larger contracts, huge geographies, and larger contract value. I mean, I bid for Flexible New Deal contracts and we won 3, the company that I was working for, and they were value of £500 million over 5 years, £500 million pounds. So huge contracts. And so this idea of the prime contractor model meant that you had new service provider enter the market. And these were huge outsourcing providers who were used to delivering public services and run private prisons or transport network or road structures, but they had access to capital, to the working capital, and they could shoulder the risk, the financial risk of a highly performance-based contract. And so the idea is that these prime contractors had the direct contract with the government, and they would then have a supply chain of service providers who were diverse. And so you could still keep in the market those smaller niche providers who didn't have the capital to become the private contractor, but had the expertise and would still deliver a really good service and job brokerage service to the job seeker. So Flexible New Deal really tested that prime contractor model. And in some organisations, the prime contractor also delivered elements of the service themselves. And other prime contractors stayed purely as prime contractors, and they were responsible for performance managing their supply chain, because their supply chain's performance was their performance, and they did not draw down any money from the government until those job outcomes was hit. So that was a real interesting test. And what we also saw in the Flexible New Deal, and Stuart alluded to this in his presentation, this idea of being more innovative and creation. Even though employment zones New Deal was paid on outcomes, the government, the DWP, was still quite prescriptive in terms of what the service looked like. In Flexible New Deal, we moved to this idea of black box. And the idea was, actually, we are buying these outcomes, and these are the outcomes, this is what we're paying for, the outcomes of job outcome at 13 weeks and sustainability at 26 weeks. What you then do, how you deliver the intervention, how you deliver the service, actually that is down to you, prime contractor. You design the service. And so actually you saw lots of different models, and that's why you saw some prime contractors also be deliverers and other prime contractors stay as the managing agent. But it really encouraged innovation in service delivery. 2 years later, new government, we had the work programme. The work programme was a continuation of the prime contractor model and a continuation of the payment by result model. And what we saw in the work programme was this testing of attaching different fees to different cohorts. And I'll come to that a little bit more later. And then in 2017, we saw the introduction of the work and health programme. That was an evolution of the work programme. So still the prime contractor model and still very much payment by result. But what the work and health programme was a programme that recognised actually unemployment in the UK. The cost to the government, the taxpayer, really sat with those people that were out of work for health and disability reason. So the people that were job seekers who were on the main unemployment benefit were a small proportion of those that were claiming benefit. The bulkness of unemployment were those that were claiming benefit, out of work benefit for health and disability reason. So this programme brought everything under one banner. And we, so including intervention for those who are out of work for disability, for poor health reasons or disability. And then we see the change of the definition of outcome. An outcome was now measured as earnings, not just sustained outcomes, staying in work for 26 weeks, but actually what are you earning in work? And then we had the Restart, which run concurrently to the work and health programme in the latter years of the work and health programme. And the Restart programme was really a national government response to the unemployment created as a result of COVID. So this was a direct response to COVID-19. And Restart was designed on the premise that people had been made redundant and were out of work for a short period of time. So actually, although many people were out of work, they only needed light touch support and would be able to go back into work quite quickly. Those assumptions proved to be wrong. And so the government had to restructure some of the contractual agreements with the service provider. So in all of these cases, the government commissioned these programmes and they commissioned them to the non-state sector through an open and competitive model. And pricing really came into play in this as well. So as a bidder, you could tell the government at what price you were going to deliver those services. But what I really want to do actually on this slide is draw your attention to the blue arrow at the bottom, the darker blue arrows at the bottom of the slide. Because what I've tried to demonstrate there is the evolution and the growth in the commissioner, in this case, the government's thinking around, okay, what is it that we want to buy? As the commissioner, what is it that we're procuring? And how are we defining outcomes? And what we see is, and we can go to the next slide actually, Justin.
Yeah, I'm just going to ask also, I mean, we've got a clock which is ticking slowly, so we will do that. But we've got a couple of speakers too. So if you wouldn't mind, maybe just wrap on this. Yeah,
wrap this up, yeah. So what we see is the evolution of what is it that we're procuring. And as government, what we're procuring now, as the commissioner, it's moved from job outcomes to recognising that people are in work, but still in poverty. So we saw an evolution of commissioning and defining outcomes as job outcomes to sustained outcomes to actually then in-work progression and quality jobs. And this is where in the latter programmes, the service provider's payment is now linked to what the job seeker's earning is in work. So what are they earning within a period of time, and they've got to hit a threshold in order for the service user to draw down that money. So I think that's a really interesting learning point that we should take into consideration for the African context. The other things to think about is, how do you use the payment structure to incentivize the right, i.e. the good behavior from the service providers? So where do you weight the payment? And we saw that on Flexible New Deal, where they switched from the initial 80-20% to 20-80% and moving the bulk of the payment to actual outcomes. And also, how can you use the accelerate payment model? So there is a challenge on outcomes-based contracts that it just focuses on those that are easier to help, and it forgets about those left behind. And so we started seeing testing of this in Restart in the Work and Health Programme, where the service provider received bonus payments for overachieving on their targets. And this is to encourage service providers to dig deeper into their caseload. But also there's a question around, how do you decide when intensive support is required, and how do you decide when a job seeker needs support and when they help themselves and get themselves into work? And this ties in with the other point just below that, which is around deadweight. Horrible, horrible terminology, but this is the concept that, is the government going to be paying the private sector to support somebody into work who would have already got themselves into work by themselves? And the data from the UK experience shows that on the mainstream unemployment benefit programme, those that claim benefit actually go into work in the first few months. And 90% of job seekers were going into work with very minimal intervention within the first year, the first 12 months of work. So if you're commissioning programme, at what stage do you bring in the intervention? At what stage of somebody's unemployment journey? And there are lots of different variations in the UK, but we just don't have time to go into that. But I guess the key point to draw out of all of this is, there's been a huge testing of an evolution of the use of payment by results or outcomes-based contracting model in the UK employment sector over the last 3 decades. And whilst it's evolved and grown, it has stuck as the primary way of funding employment programmes at national level, but also at local, regional level, and by other commissioners, not just government. There is one more slide, Justin, but it was really me preempting some questions that the audience might have. And so I think I'm happy to skip that slide.
Okay.
And we can leave it there, and anything that hasn't been
put it up. Yeah.
If the questions come up, we can address it there.
Shamsa, thank you. And it's, I mean, as for such nascent programs in this continent, to see some of the features that we almost, are part of the legacy of your experience in the United Kingdom, featuring now this different weightings of payments, the timings of payments, how you deal with incentives. These are fascinating questions for us to understand. And thank you so much for sharing that experience. It's been a remarkable eye-opener for many of us on the call. So thank you very, very much. Audience, if you have questions around this stuff, please use the Q&A, and we'll look to pick those up in a minute. So I'm going to shift focus now, and our next speaker is going to be Killian. Killian, as I mentioned at the beginning, joining us from Dar es Salaam. And one of the things that we see in South Africa, clearly the UK has a very different welfare system, a very different economic model in many cases. In a lot of African countries, we have businesses who contribute payroll levies and into a national type of skills fund, and nominally or notionally that those levies are supposed to fund public sector training programs which deliver a ready source of skilled young work seekers into jobs and into businesses. All too often, however, that is not the case. There's some kind of disconnect that's underway there. And that has implications for business. I think there's often a degree of resentment or certainly unhappiness about the effectiveness of these levies and even their point. But it also has a direct bearing on the fact that many young people who are the product of such programs and spending are not able to then find opportunities at the end of that. So Killian, I'm going to hand over to you, please. You don't have any slides, so I'm going to leave Shamja's last slide up for the audience just to enjoy and think about questions. Killian, if you could take it away, please, for the next 7-10 minutes. You're on mute still, by the way, so don't forget to unmute.
Thanks, Justin. Thanks to Shamsi for laying the the groundwork. And thanks to everybody for joining this webinar today. So I'm calling from Tanzania. Very exciting to join all of you here. So I will start where you left, Justin. So yes, so many young people left unemployed, frustrated, and disengaged. And that has social consequences, it has economic consequences, but also it has a political consequences. We've seen what is happening in Kenya, the Gen Z protest. We've seen what's happened in other countries, including Sudan and many other countries. African governments have failed to leverage the demographic dividend and providing much needed jobs for these young people. So because of time, I'll throw in some numbers. Justin spoke about Zambia. So Zambia, we have 375 young people enter the job market every year. And guess what? Only 137,000 people are getting employed. So we have almost 64% of young people left unemployed. And our estimate, from research shows that Zambia will continue producing over 375 young people every year up to 2030. So we can understand the magnitude of the problem that Zambia is going to create. Now, let me take close to home, Zanzibar. We have almost 27 young people unemployed with a country of 1,800,000 people. That is one of the largest youth unemployment in East Africa. Of course, in fact, it is 4 times to other countries. Kenya, we have 31.5 young people unemployed. With a population of 56 million, we've seen what has happened. Ethiopia, 26.8 young people unemployed. With a population of 132 million, there's so much the government can harness if we deploy right resources and tools to address youth unemployment. But the key question is, what is the common denominator? What we have seen at the heart of this problem is the disconnect, and we call it triangular disconnect. The disconnect between employers on one side, the job seekers on the other side, and skills providers on the other side. So that disconnect between employers, job seekers, and skills provider is what has created this massive problem. Of course, it's one of the reasons which has created these problems. Now, on the side of skills providers, there's a mismatch between their curriculum and the demand of the industry. Second, they focus more on theory rather than practical, what is needed by the job market. On the employer, sometimes they fail to communicate, or the language they use to communicate job opportunities does not resonate well with their market that they're trying to address. On the trainers, on the employees, people who are looking for jobs, they're more focused on white-collar jobs. That is one. Second, also, they don't have practical knowledge or experience. And then as a result, it yields to huge unemployment problem. Now, I'll take you back to Zanzibar. Zanzibar, 80% of the country depend on tourism sector. There's a huge potential there, massive opportunity. 5 to 8% GDP growth year on year post-COVID. But guess what? We have 27% of young people unemployed. Now, the GDP is growing, the investment is growing. What employers are doing now, they're importing labor from overseas, India, Pakistan, America, South Africa, you name it. So that is to say, jobs are created, but young people don't have relevant skills and tools that will enable them to take up these jobs. Justin, you spoke about government collecting levies. Yes, government is collecting 3.5% of the total wage bill from every employer. Now, the thinking is that fund that is collected by the government should be able to be invested in a way that can provide young people with transferable skills that can be used by the market or the industry, and that is not happening. Under this forum, I think that's a very pertinent question. How should government, employers, trainers, service providers, outcome funders, DFIs, and job seekers do? And how can we utilize outcome thinking, outcome payment to drive youth unemployment? Justin, I'll stop there. And because of time, I'm more than happy to take questions. Justin?
That's brilliant, Killian. Thank you so much. And I think you've posed some wonderful questions, and you've teed up Riyad's slot quite nicely because you've introduced all the actors. You've framed the problem particularly well, and the interplay of all those different actors trying to address this particularly acute challenge. And just for those of you who don't know, the Jobs Boost program in South Africa is an initiative of the Presidential Youth Employment Initiative, funded by the National Skills Fund, which is an agency of the Department of Higher Education and Training here in South Africa. Riyad is the program director of that program, and I'm going to hand over to him now, Riyad, if you don't mind, to give us some of the highlights of Jobs Boost. It's been running officially, just contracted in 2023, but really kicked off with implementing partners under that prime contractor model, if to use Shamsi's language, in July last year, and we're now just over a year into that. So if you could take it away, Riyad, and share some of the highlights, please, with our audience.
Thanks, Justin, and good afternoon to everyone. Just broadly an introduction to the fund. So the focus of the Jobs Boost Outcomes Fund is to place excluded youth that are either unemployed or in precarious employment into quality jobs. And so those are jobs that are fully remunerated by the final employer, and contracts of 12 months minimum. And the full, as I said, the full remuneration must be by the final employer, and it must be at minimum wage or higher, according to South Africa. So that's the focus of the fund. As Justin mentioned, it's the outcomes funder is the Department of Higher Education and Training via the National Skills Fund. It's part of the broader Presidential Youth Employment Intervention. It is a pilot at the moment, and we are actually kind of in the last stages of that, wrapping it up and looking to scale the program. If you go to the next slide, Justin, I want to just briefly mention the structuring of the fund. So the fund is structured in a special purpose vehicle, which is the Jobs Boost Outcomes Fund. The technical assistance and technical funding. So the technical funding that was initially provided helped to set up a lot of the documentation and help to do the research and that around the program and get it all in place. And then Crutham and one of our legal partners also provides some assistance to get some of the program in order. As I mentioned, the Outcomes Fund is the National Skills Fund. We operate via 12 implementing partners, reaching 5,500 youth, approximately. All of the outcomes are independently audited by two different auditors, one auditor for the first milestone payment and the other auditor for the next three. And I'll talk briefly through what those 4 milestones are. In terms of what we projected at the start of the program, what we were aiming for based on the proposals and that were received, we were looking to spend close to 288 million rand in outcomes payments. and we're aiming for 5,500 jobs. Just to mention something about their target, initially our target originally with the National Skills Fund was 4,500. Through the different proposals and the lower costing, we actually ended up with a higher target than that, which we quite confident we will be able to reach or get very, very close to. I'm not going to spend too much of time on the breakdown of the program, of the structure. I want to rather go on to the next slide and talk through what we've achieved to date. So within sort of we're just over 12 months now, or coming on to the 12-month mark, sorry. We've got over 8,500 enrollments into the program, so we've exceeded our target on enrollments, which is the easy one. In terms of job placements, we've got close to 6,000 placements verified into employment, and we've already measured over 2,500 3 months sustained employment placements and over 1,000 sustained 6 months placements, and we've dispersed over 160 million rand, which is I think about 9.5 million USD or thereabouts to date. In terms of the milestones that I mentioned earlier, our milestones are broken down into enrollment, placement, 3 months sustained employment, and 6 months sustained employment. Even though our contracts we require contracts of 12 months or longer, we're measuring it at 6 months, and that's merely for the duration of the program, so that we are able to measure it within a kind of a quicker period to deliver on the pilot. And the partners receive approximately 20% of the grants per candidate at the enrollment stage, 40% on placement, 20% on sustained employment for 3 months, and 20% on sustained employment for 6 months. And then on screen at the moment, you'll see the 12 implementing partners that we've worked with. Some of them have been massive successes. One of them in particular has received 2 target expansions due to achieving their targets early, and then having the capacity to actually take on more youth. And then some of the programs have also not been as successful as that and have received target reductions. And the contracting that we have allows us to do that based on over or underperformance. And so we've been quite adaptable to the performance of our partners, which is why we're, our targets constantly with some of the partners either go down or go up a bit. Yeah, and onto the next slide, just some of the screenshots from the system. So I know we'll get into a little bit more of a discussion, and I'll go through some of the details in a bit. But one of the big investments that we made at the start of the program, or one of the strategic investments, was in a bespoke data management system. And we think that that is one of the key successes of this program. And I just pulled through some screenshots. This is what we're seeing kind of in real time. And at the moment, as you can see, our data, we've got our youth employed through 197 employers. And the average monthly salary is about 5.2 thousand Rand or 5,200 Rand, which is actually about 20% higher than minimum wage. And of our enrollments, we're seeing about 73% that have been placed into employment. And you can also see that in terms of our target tracking, we're above target on our enrollments. Our placements are a little bit behind, but we anticipate by the end of this month, we're going to fully meet our placement targets. And so excited about where we're going to land after the full program and the evaluation that we are conducting. And I think we probably would do a webinar around that as well in terms of the lessons learned and how we can improve even further.
Thank you, Riyad. Really appreciate that whistle-stop tour through Jobs Boost. And I'm always just struck by connecting what you were saying with Shamsa's, those learnings about how the UK program's adapted, and for instance, this feature within Jobs Boost to be able to dynamically reallocate targets between partners. I'm sure, Shamsa, if you went back 20 years or so in those early stage programs, probably quite rigid contracting, and yet now working through a prime contractor model, the outcomes funder doesn't really care. They're just dealing with one counterparty in one interface, and yet the main contract or the main administrator in Riyad's diagram, that's that special purpose vehicle there, can actually move targets. And so the overall targets don't change, but the people who are delivering them does mix and move over time. And having this real-time data system enables a degree of adaptability on the fly, which is quite encouraging, and a really useful feature to be able to take forward as we take structures like Jobs Boost and look to build them and develop them in the continent. So Rebecca, thank you. We haven't forgotten about your question. And Stuart, I'm going to ask you to deal with that. You've had a bit of time to think about it. But also potentially, once you've dealt with that, just to maybe pick up on briefly, you've attended a couple of outcomes-based conferences in Cali and Colombia recently, the Government Outcomes Lab in Oxford. If you could perhaps share a couple of not instincts, I beg your pardon, some of the emerging developments that are coming out of those events as well.
Sure, Justin. I think the UK is the most experienced market in the world, and Shamsa's history was really fascinating and how it's developed. A lot of other markets are now really accelerating in their implementation of outcomes-based approaches. So it's fascinating to learn from those that are several years down the line in how they can evolve into reaching into the harder to get to parts of a social intervention. So Shamsa, I think, highlighted the evolution of the UK to where health factors can be a major driver of unemployment. So, you can cream skim those who are quite easy to get into employment, but it's going to get harder and harder. And certainly in markets like Australia, we see the same thing. You also see sort of gaming of the outcomes, people who are meeting the technical definition of an outcome, but often not by sticking to the spirit. And how do you design schemes that are resilient against the experiences partners build and how they might aim to game the system. I think another area of evolution that is quite important, and you do see this particularly in the UK, is the notion of outcomes partnerships, where the focus is on using the outcome as a broad incentive structure across a partnership from government to implementing partner. So that point I made about the risk being transferred fully onto the implementing partner, this is almost a winding back of that risk distribution and government taking back some of the risks on its shoulders. Now that's really important, and in the way we think about risk allocation today, it's the important question is who is best capable of managing the risk, and managing can mean lots of different things. Reducing the probability that it will that a risk will eventuate, and then reducing the cost if it does eventuate, or then absorbing the cost if it does eventuate. Who between government and implementing partner is best positioned to do those things? And when we refine the way we allocate risk these days, that is becoming much more sophisticated. So you don't expect an implementing partner to carry, for example, a COVID lockdown type of risk, which is really something they can't control. Mm-hmm. That sort of risk is perhaps better left on the shoulders of government, which has a much bigger balance sheet. I think Rebecca's question is really interesting and important on timelines and volatile economies, and let me also say volatile political environments. And Shamsa's point that these programs change with each change in government is even, that's amplified in the African context, where you can get significant changes, and sometimes that can affect programs in midstream. And in an outcomes fund, that's particularly problematic because your implementing partners are carrying the credit risk, right? They're spending the money to run programs to achieve these outcomes. And if you get a sudden change, there is this risk that your outcome, when you send that invoice, is not going to get paid. So in the design of programs and managing that credit risk for implementation partners is really important. So what we have developed in Crutham is structures that put cash up front in trust, so that you have full reliability using kind of escrow mechanisms for implementing partners to trust that that money is actually there when they deliver the outcomes at the end of a program. And you make sure that all of your contracting structures are designed to cover the full period of delivery rather than the election cycle, so that you can be confident that you're not going to be disrupted midway through a program. In terms of timelines, so our view is that to properly design an outcome structure, you need 6 months of research and development. It takes time to properly interrogate what the true barriers to achieving outcomes are, and to make sure you design for those true barriers. For a program itself, I think there is a variation depending on what you want to achieve. There are certain relatively short-term skills interventions that can get you to your outcomes. So Jobs Boost has been a relatively short-term intervention where training programs can be at most 12 months. And in fact, most training programs are far shorter than that. Than Rio, off the top of your head, I would think. So a lot of them probably average at about less than 3 months. And you can get people into jobs, but you will find that there are certain types of jobs and also types of candidates where you're going to need more time. So when you start to focus in on those harder to reach young people or unemployed, you will need to change that timeline. So I hope that gives you the idea. Rebecca, your last point there on the economy changing. So you don't know what the jobs are going to be in the future. Now, I think to go back to the point of risks you can manage and can't manage, it's a very interesting debate over who can manage the risk of dynamic economic change. We like to think that, and we've certainly seen the evidence, that some implementing partners are better than others at understanding where the goalposts are moving to and running programs that aim for the goalposts as they're going to be in 6 months to 12 months' time. Governments are really bad at that. But implementing partners who are down on the ground and really engaged with employers can be better at that. So we think outcomes funds actually reduce that risk of misalignment of the skills to what the jobs will be when we eventually get there. Hope that answers your questions.
Thanks, Stuart. That's great. Shams, I want to bring you in here. One of the features that Riyad showed on his structural diagram was impact investors. And that brings the ability, and we've been speaking about working capital needs, and you mentioned it too. Social impact bonds are a slightly different pay for results type program. Do you want to just touch on those for a second, and also that sort of connection with how impact investors can have a role here in this ecosystem?
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, Justin. So impact bonds, whether they're known as social impact bond because the investor is domestic, or development impact bond because of funder and so forth, maybe international development, really are another instrument in terms of results-based financing or outcomes-based contracting. And it's a way of addressing that working capital issue. And to take a step back, I guess SIBS started in the UK back in 2010 and started in the offending sector.
That's right. Yeah.
Peterborough prison, and looking at reducing reoffending. And that was lauded and seen as a really good example, and kind of has spread. And impact bonds have continued in the UK and elsewhere, and the government has really got involved sort of in that as well. But in the employment arena, it's one way of addressing that working capital issue. If you are a provider and you are if you're a service provider and you're working on an employment program and you're only being paid on outcomes, how do you attract that? How do you attract that initial working capital that's required to set up to set up the program, to set up the implementation? And so what Impact Bond does is it brings in a third party, an investor, who takes the risk of performance. And they say, actually, we'll come in as the investor. The contract is with the commissioner, and we will only be paid by the commissioner once the outcomes are achieved, and in most cases a small return.
Yes.
But we provide the working capital to the service provider. So the service provider is able to continue providing the service, knowing that working capital is there, and they might have a different payment structure. Actually, they might continue to be paid as a grant or a kind of for service, or they might be paid on the results. But that risk is carried by this investor, this other party that's coming. So it's really about transferring that risk and giving access to working capital for that provider. But it's also a way of mobilizing private capital. And so for government, it's a great way of bringing private capital into public services in a way that you may not have otherwise brought in.
And so private capital presumably would also include philanthropic capital in that too.
Yes, and when I say
philanthropic.
private, I'm using it in the broadest terms, apologies, in meaning anything that's not state, not public.
Yeah. Okay. And I know certainly in South Africa's case of 2 social impact bonds, and before COVID, they were operating. There was definitely private capital involved as investors in exactly the model that you described there.
Yeah.
Which is fantastic. Thank you. Killian, firstly, just a reminder, there was a question directed at you on the Q&A. So if you do have a moment, Killian, if you could just type a response to Jerry, I think if I've said your name correctly, on Zambia. But secondly, I think, your perspective you provided about this nexus of the three-way interplay, this triangular interplay you described. What would you say the benefit then to employers, to governments would be, and to skills providers of outcomes fund structures, in the region? Let's assume we can roll them out and start an evolution like Shamsia was describing in the UK.
No, thanks, Justin. Very interesting question. So first of all, I've already replied the question. So
Okay, thank you.
So you see, the government is collecting funds, and especially for Africa governments, where many are, poor and they have very limited, fiscal resources. The outcome fund is about driving fiscal efficiency. It's about bringing in accountability. It's about, driving in transparency in the way that the government is running their programs. Outcome fund is about attracting private sector money or funds, as Shamsia, said. And in an era where there's, where funding is very limited, like now from DFIs and other philanthropic partners, this presents a unique opportunity for government, to drive youth employment, creation. Stuart said it, and I repeat, for implementing partner is about how can you design programs that resonate with the market demand? How can you bring in innovation? How can you understand the market need and design programs and skilling programs that can solve this problem? So there's so much advantage or benefit. All of us are working to solve the unemployment problem, Justin. And maybe to touch with as a very high level, Justin, there's another angle of driving youth employment through enterprise. But that is very complex. But this is just to throw out there. But outcome funding and structure can use also to drive enterprise development. Now, when you drive enterprise development, in a way, you're creating jobs for young people. I'll park there. Yes. Thank you, Justin.
No, indeed, Killian. I think it's a very topical issue in South Africa at the moment, and trying to improve the number and grow the number of small businesses, which is largely seen as the best way to employ young people at scale. And so you make a very, very important contribution there. Thank you for that. I'm conscious of the time, everyone. It's 4:20, but I'm going to ask Riyad to close off with us today. Riyad, you, before joining Jobs Boost as our program director, you spent a significant amount of your working career in the grant management space, working on that side of things, and often interfaced and had to deal with impact measurement matters, which are significant in, for philanthropies, and people want to know how their money is being used. Now, if you were to contrast that previous life now with what you do now in Jobs Boost from an impact measurement and impact management perspective, Riyad, I'm sure it'd be interesting for our audience just to have some perspectives around that. And indeed, you alluded to the system that JobsBoost uses, how that helps you.
Thanks, Justin. From an impact management perspective, your effort is very similar, and also there's some parts that are completely different. The one thing that you do have to still do, even though it's results-based or outcomes-based funding, is that you do have to keep a very close relationship with your implementing partners. And you do have to walk the journey with them throughout the process so that you are aware of what's coming, what's happening, what challenges they're having, and so on, so that you can adapt earlier on. It's definitely not a lower effort. The risk is not that there's going to be funds wasted. That's the advantage. The risk here is that if you're not proactive enough and agile enough in your impact management, you're going to end up with too much funds left on the table. And that's a big risk that is constant with outcomes-based financing. And I think one of the things that we saw was that we had to adapt very quickly, and having the close relationship with the partners allowed us to do that. And so, your effort is similar in the amount of time in that you have to spend. But you've also got this focus on what the outcomes are on speaking to the youth that are already employed, not the youth that are in training that are going to get employed. So it's a little bit of a change around where you're spending time doing the outcome, kind of discussing with employers in that. And so you sit somewhere between the input level and the output level, or outcomes level. But yeah, I'd say in terms of your volume of work in that, it's very similar to your traditional grant. It's just what you're looking at. Your view is a little bit different based on predicted outcomes.
Thank you, Riyad. And I was just struck by one of the statistics that you mentioned there, that the network effect of this, because you have 12 implementing partners in JobsBoost and then over 160 or 190 employers. And so it's not just 12 people employing, you've got nearly 200 people actively involved in the employment. And Killian, I think that talks to, this point you made about the ability to reach more employers through a structure like this, where it's up to the innovation and the creativity of the implementing partner, your service provider, who's actually going to find those opportunities, make the connections, and place young people in there in order to get paid and achieve their milestones. My panelists, I really want to thank you for all the contribution and the efforts that you've made today. It's been a really fascinating 90 minutes, or just about. To the people on board, thank you so much for taking the time this afternoon or this evening or this morning, wherever you happen to be in the world, for joining us. The recording will be available shortly, or if not, you should have it by the latest tomorrow. Do have a look at the JobsBoost website. Stuart posted it in the chat. There's some amazing up-to-date statistics, and Riyad's journey that he's just given you a little snapshot on is visible through that. It's an important part of the program, is to be transparent about where things have worked, and indeed, as Riyad said, where things have not worked so well. I'd like to just end off, for those of you in South Africa, enjoy a happy Heritage Day tomorrow. And thank you all very much for your attendance today. Take care, and we'll see you again soon.
Thank you all. Cheers.
Thank you all. Cheers.